We'll start a series of 5-minute rounds, and I'll recognize myself. And this is really for both of you. In the last 5 years, the PRC employed economic coercion against several of our closest allies and partners. When governments made decisions that the PRC didn't like, Beijing pursued, as the Secretary mentioned, an embargo on Lithuania. It levied tariffs and trade restrictions on Australian agricultural products, coal, beef, and timber. It imposed trade restrictions on Canadian products and even jailed 2 Canadian citizens, and the list goes on. The People's Republic of China has also made efforts to intimidate and coerce the private sector, even threatening American companies if they didn't lobby against legislation in the United States that Congress was promoting and that Beijing didn't like. This is something that always drives me crazy, is when I have business people come and talk to me, and basically they are espousing the views of another country. As I said to one of these business leaders, that's rather un-American. Given the gravity of these challenges, I would ask that you both clearly define the scope of the PRC economic coercion and the specific tactics that Beijing employs. And what's our foreign policy playbook to address, you've each touched upon it, but to address PRC coercion? I know that this is, what we're discussing is a broad policy, but the People's Republic of China is probably the biggest entity that uses economic coercion in a way that is really consequential to foreign policy and national interests.
Thank you for the question, Senator. So when we think about economic coercion, we're thinking typically of practices where it's illegitimate or arbitrary use of economic restrictions, typically under false pretense. So we often see it as it's a claim that it's a commercial dispute or it's something else, but it's really about a diplomatic action. And so we know that it is a pernicious force. I think in your opening remarks, you referred to the subtle economic coercion, where it's not, we have the cases, we can all list them as you say, but it's also countries that worry about being cut off, whether it's from inputs or foreign direct investment. So I think when we try to deal with this, we do it in a variety of ways. I think one place we start is with analysis, trying to look at our own vulnerabilities to make sure we are not vulnerable to these types of coercion and where we might and how we might address that. And so one way we can address that is through the efforts we've been taking to build out resilient supply chains to make sure that we are not vulnerable to a particular cutoff of a particular choke point. And that's a very important one for our own economic security. But it also means as long as we're building out diversified supply chains, that works for the rest of the world as well, to make sure that there are options outside of 100% dependency on China for a particular choke point of an input. I think we also do a lot of coordination. So as I mentioned, the G7 has taken up this issue quite strongly this year and tried to work through how we might coordinate in potential actions against one of us, but also to your point earlier about your conversation with the minister from Panama, how we can help our friends, which I think is crucial. And so I think we have also taken it up with what's referred to the 5 finance ministers, the finance ministers that are from the Five Eyes countries where we can share intelligence, and that lets us have these conversations in a more detailed way where we can do so using intelligence products as well. And so this is something Treasury takes incredibly seriously. We know it is a risk both to our ability to engage in foreign policy because they can threaten our friends, but also it can be a threat to our economy. And so we're working on it quite actively.
I want to hear from Secretary Menendez, but while I have you,
sure.
You know, one of the concerns I have is that we don't necessarily, from my perspective, use our vote, our voice and our vote at some of these international financial institutions in a way that I think is important. We saw the COVID pandemic and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine exacerbate debt crises and create more unsustainable debt for low-income nations, with many of them turning to the IMF as the lender of last resort. Ghana, Sri Lanka, Pakistan were just some, but also here in our hemisphere, we have countries who are coming out of the post-pandemic era and with others challenges, and we're not looking, I'm not an advocate of forgiveness At least it depends on the nation. But I am an advocate, of course, of a smoothing out period of time so these people can get through it. But many of these nations, including those that are aligned with us in values and our democracies, say, but you leave us hanging. You're not an advocate of a smoothing out process so that I can meet my obligation but do it in a way that doesn't create civil unrest in my country. I think about the Dominican Republic as an example, who has problems with Haiti next door, who is aligned with us in terms of democratic values, but they're in the midst of a vice with the IMF. I would hope that I think Treasury has a very important role to play here, and it needs, from my perspective, needs to be more robust. Let me give Secretary Fernandez an opportunity to address the question, then I'll turn to Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We would define economic coercion as when a country weaponizes the economic vulnerabilities of the target in order to punish it for the exercise of its sovereignty. As you noted, we've seen it certainly for the last 10, 12 years, starting with Korea, and the last one was Lithuania. All of these actions have three things in common, I would say. Number one, they take advantage of a vulnerability, of an economic dependency. Secondly, they are opaque. It's not as if the PRC says we are going to impose coercion on you. They use phytosanitary reasons. Sometimes they don't even announce that they're imposing measures, and that is quite common. They obfuscate. So the obfuscation piece is important. And third, the idea is to change behavior, to impose a cost for changing behavior. That's why I think, and you noted this in your remarks, that's why I think we'll see this over and over again. Even when they are not used, just the threat of sanctions is a deterrence. In terms of a playbook, we've put one together. It's a work in progress. We learn from experience. But we learned from Lithuania that Exim Bank had tools, that DoD had tools, USDA had tools, Commerce as well. We have had several discussions with allies and partners on this. We've also had internal tabletop exercises just to prepare. We are learning as we go along, and a couple of things we've learned is we need speed. This can't be a 30, 40-day exercise. There are governments that may fall if they are coerced. And secondly, we need flexibility. The types of measures that are taken by the PRC will depend on the country, will depend on the sectors that they are targeting. So we need to be able to be nimble. Something we've identified, for example, is what happens if you have agricultural goods that may be perishable, bananas on a dock waiting for permits. So all of these are items that we would very much welcome, working with your staff and everyone else's to make sure that we've got the tools. But this is something we are putting a lot of effort into, together with our colleagues at Treasury and together with the G7.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me just make an observation. I very much hope that what we can do is have a whole of government approach that is planned versus simply reactive. And of course, one cannot foresee every possibility, but one can have a pretty good idea of what the PRC does in broad bases. And so if we had a comprehensive all-of-government approach plan, you mentioned several entities, not just Treasury and State, but Commerce and our international financial institutions, as well as our development institutions, that needs a cohesive all-of-government approach. And I'm glad you mentioned nimbleness, because I have tried sometimes to intercede with the administration when a country is really on the ropes, but they are aligned with us in values. And if we were on the basketball court, we would be losing really badly because we are far from nimble. I understand the interagency process, but that can be a death knell at the end of the day. So, Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just